Hi everyone, my name is Lydia and this is what I wish they taught me about econometrics and introduction. We've covered a lot of ground in this arc for IV. We've talked about endogeneity, reverse causality, instruments, relevance, exclusion, 2SLS, order, and rank. This video brings it all together into one clean reference. So come back to this video whenever you're working on an IV strategy, in an exam, a dissertation, or a research paper, because everything is in this video. So the first point where we started from was why use IV? There were three main causes, which were omitted variable bias, so a missing variable affecting both the X and the Y. We had reverse causality, which we said it's very likely what you will always see as the root cause of you using IV. In this case, Y also affected X. And the other one is measurement error, where X is measured with noise, and that is correlated with your error term. Okay. And keep in mind, these were all the three cases where your covariance of X and U is no longer equal to 0. Right? In all of these three cases, OLS is biased and inconsistent, and IV is the solution when a valid instrument exists. Which brings us to the question, what is a valid instrument? A valid instrument, Z must satisfy the two conditions or three conditions, keep in mind, depending on the book or lecture slides that you have. Condition number one is the relevance condition, which mathematically we write as the covariance between your instrument and your X endogenous variable needs to be different from 0. So this is testable, and you can check it through the first stage F statistic or directly the t-test on the particular Z variable. The second condition is the exclusion condition, which tells us that Z affects Y only through X, no direct path, which means that the covariance between Z and the error term, where everything else that is affecting Y exists, this needs to be equal to 0. This is not directly testable. This is also called the validity condition or exogeneity condition or independence assumption. Must be dependent with theory and also institutional knowledge. And keep in mind, while here I've written two condition book bundle, exclusion and exogeneity together, three condition books separate them, but both framings lead to the same requirements. The naming varies by the textbook. Why and how can we defend the exclusion restriction? Keep in mind, since exclusion cannot be tested directly, researchers defend it using either institutional knowledge, either timing, why Z is determined before Y, natural experiments, Z is plausibly random, or placebo test. There is a separate video on how to defend the exclusion restriction, so make sure you refer to that one if you want a more in-depth view on it. The thing that you have to remember, though, is that the strongest IV papers spend as much time defending the instrument as they do running the regression. So keep that in mind if you are doing your dissertation while using an IV methodology. Also, when you have an over-identified model, more instruments than endogenous variables, the Sargan-Hansen test is the one that provides partial evidence of consistency. But keep in mind, passing the test is not proof of validity. Which brings us then to the identification conditions. For the identification conditions, you have to consider two additional conditions for 2SLS to work. The order condition, which is, as we said, a quantity condition, because we checked whether the number of instruments is bigger than the number of endogenous variables. That gave you depending on how these two numbers compare, either a just identified model with number of instruments being equal to the number of endogenous variables, over-identified with more instruments than endogenous variables, or under-identified with less instruments than endogenous variable, which was basically a useless case to be in. And the rank condition, which was what we called the quality condition, because this was the condition that tells us that instruments must provide sufficiently independent variation. These can be checked through first stage F statistics. Formally, the first stage coefficient matrix must have a full rank. So order checks whether you have enough instruments, rank checks whether they are doing independent work, and both must hold. So separately, they are both necessary, but also not sufficient. Together, they both must hold for you to be able to work with 2SLS. The last bit that we would have to go through for the 2SLS is the two stages. But for that, you have a separate video, so make sure you go through that to check the two stages. The last bit is a practical checklist that you can follow if you're ever doing homework based on an IV problem, or if you're writing your dissertation and you're making a mental checklist of the things that you need to make sure that you're covering. So before you run and report any IV strategy, what you have to remember to ask yourself is, how many endogenous variables do you have? Which means identify your source. Do you have OVP? Do you have reverse causality? Are you sure you only have one endogenous variable? Is there potentially another endogenous variable that is afflicting your model? Second question, do I at least have as many instruments as I have your endogenous variable? And most importantly, at the same time, when we say, do I at least have as many instruments, is, do you know your instruments well? So what are your instruments? Okay, so you have to make sure you name the instruments, and you have to explain where the variation comes from. Are my instruments sufficiently independent? Okay. Does each instrument satisfy relevance? Always make sure you check the first stage regression. Can you defend the exclusion restriction for each instrument? And if over-identified, do my instruments pass the Sargan-Hansen test? Okay. The last bit that I am going to add in here, and that is especially important in your discussion, is how does 2SLS compare to OLS? Are they similar? That means OLS may not have been badly biased if you know that your instruments are good. Are they very different? Which means, well, yeah, endogeneity was quite a serious problem at that stage. Okay. This checklist, in a sense, covers every video in this mini IV arc. If you can answer all of these questions, it's very likely that your IV strategy is shaping up well. Now, if we refer to the actual example that we saw together with the Angst and Kruger paper, you can run this checklist to see how that is applied in an actual paper, so that then you can emulate the same sort of procedure. For instance, in the paper, we saw that they did have an endogenous variable because ability affects both education and earnings. So there was an omitted variable bias. What was their instrument? It was quarter of birth. And then relevance condition, birth quarter affects school leaving age through compulsory schooling laws. So they showed also a very strong first stage. What about the exclusion? You can check for the exclusion. The way they defend it is that birth quarter has no plausible direct effect on earnings, and it was argued using institutional knowledge. They do check the order condition. They've got one instrument, one endogenous variable, which means they have a just identified model. In terms of rank condition, they have single endogenous variables, which, as we said in the previous videos, it reduces to the relevance condition, and they already showed a very strong first stage. The Sargan-Hansen test, since they had a just identified model, did not apply. And in terms of OLS and IV, the paper actually showed that they had very similar results, which suggested that, to begin with, maybe there was very little bias in the OLS. Okay. A valid IV strategy, remember, requires a relevant instrument, a defensible exclusion restriction, satisfied order and rank conditions, and 2SLS uses the instrument's claimed variation to recover a causal effect. Now that we have the complete picture, in the next video, we derive the 2SLS estimator formally and see exactly where the formula comes from. So stay tuned, and I'll see you then.